The morning of March 3rd, 1986, began like any other in the quiet town of Maple Ridge, Tennessee, until a neighbor's dog started barking at something near the woods behind Highway 11. When police arrived, they found what the dog had discovered: the remains of a woman, half buried beneath pine needles. No ID, no purse, no wallet, just a gold cross necklace clutched in her hand and a note beside her body that read, "Forgive me, I tried." No fingerprints, no suspects, no witnesses. Locals called her the Pinewood Jane Doe. For 36 years, no one knew who she was or what she'd tried to escape, until the man who killed her confessed, by accident. In 2022, Detective Marcus Lyle of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was reprocessing unsolved homicide files when he came across the Pinewood case. He almost skipped it. The file was thin, just a few faded photos and that single handwritten note. But one detail caught his attention: the cross necklace. The evidence tag listed it as 14-karat gold with an engraving on the back. 2C, Love Always, M. The tag didn't specify what M stood for, and the engraving had never led to anything. Lyle sent it for re-examination under a new micro-residue test. Days later, the lab called. "Detective, there's DNA under the clasp. Male, strong sample." The result hit the database and matched a living person. His name was Michael Reed, 62 years old, a retired pastor living outside Knoxville. He had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, but his DNA was on the necklace of a woman buried 200 miles away. Lyle and his partner, Detective Annette Carson, paid him a visit. He greeted them calmly, wearing a cardigan and a soft smile. When they mentioned the Pinewood case, he froze for half a second, then asked, "After all these years, you still found her?" That sentence made the detective stop. Lyle leaned forward. "You knew her?" Reed nodded slowly. "Her name was Claire Martin. She used to sing at my church." The detectives exchanged glances. The original file listed the victim as unidentified. He'd just given her a name. He invited them inside, offered coffee, and began to talk, not like a suspect, but like a man carrying something too heavy for too long. "Claire was 23, he said. "She came to us after leaving her husband. She said he hit her. She stayed at the church shelter for a few weeks. I thought I was helping her." Carson asked what happened next. He looked down at his hands. "She told me she was leaving Tennessee. I offered to drive her to the station. That was the last time anyone saw her alive." When asked why his DNA was on the necklace, Reed said quietly, "Because I put it on her. It was a gift." He stared out the window for a long moment before whispering, "She forgave me before she died." That was enough for Lyle. The detectives brought him in for questioning. Inside the interview room, the story began to unravel. Reed spoke calmly, never raising his voice, never flinching when photos were placed in front of him. He admitted that he and Claire had developed what he called a spiritual connection. He said she'd wanted to leave her past behind, but when she told him she was going to California to start over with someone else, he panicked. "I begged her to stay," he said. "She said God would forgive me, no matter what I did, so I tested him." Then came the sentence that froze the room. "I buried her myself. I prayed over the grave." Detective Lyle leaned forward. "Why the note? 'Forgive me, I tried.'" Reed blinked, confused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "She didn't write that. I did." For a long time, no one spoke. He continued, "It was meant for God, not her. I asked for forgiveness before I covered her." Lyle switched on the recorder. "Mr. Reed, are you confessing to the murder of Claire Martin?" He nodded once, slowly. "Yes." The next day, TBI exhumed the remains of Pinewood Jane Doe for DNA confirmation. The results matched a living cousin from Mississippi, confirming her identity as Claire Martin, missing since 1986. The news hit the small town like thunder. A beloved pastor, a buried secret, a handwritten confession disguised as faith. Reporters filled the courthouse steps. Parishioners refused to believe it. One told the press, "He baptized my children. He preached about forgiveness. I don't believe he killed anyone." But the evidence said otherwise. The necklace, the note, his own words. In custody, Reed began writing letters, not to lawyers or family, but to Detective Lyle. Each began with the same line, "There are others." At first, Lyle dismissed it as manipulation, but as the letters continued, Reed began describing details, towns, dates, names, all connected to missing women from the 1980s. Most were from shelters or church programs. One letter ended with a phrase that made Lyle's blood run cold. "They all said God would forgive me," and he did. The Tennessee Bureau reopened 6 dormant missing persons cases tied to Reed's ministry roots. Each matched a pattern: transient young women who vanished without a trace, all connected to faith-based aid centers. When confronted, Reed refused to elaborate, saying only, "I told you the truth you asked for. The rest belongs to God." Detective Carson said later, he didn't confess out of guilt. He confessed because he wanted to be remembered. The final interview ended with Reed whispering, "Do you believe God forgives murder if it's done in mercy?" Lyle replied, "No, but maybe he forgives lies." That night, Lyle reread the note. "Forgive me, I tried." He realized something. The handwriting didn't match Reed's. A new forensic handwriting analysis confirmed it. The note wasn't written by him at all. It was Claire's. Under microscopic light, her fingerprints were found faintly in the ink. She'd written it herself, minutes before she died. Lyle closed the file with one final thought. Maybe she wasn't forgiving him. Maybe she was forgiving herself for trusting him. The case that began with silence ended with 2 confessions, one written in fear and one spoken in pride. And between them, 36 years of dust finally settled. The confession of Pastor Michael Reed tore through Tennessee like a wound reopening after decades. For Maple Ridge, a town that had built its identity around church bells and Sunday sermons, the idea that its spiritual leader had been a murderer was almost impossible to accept. The courthouse was packed every day of the preliminary hearings. Former church members wept openly in the hallways, clutching Bibles as reporters shouted. Detective Marcus Lyle stood on the courthouse steps, watching the crowd. He'd been through dozens of murder trials, but none of them felt like this, like faith itself was on trial. Inside the evidence room, he reread the letters Reed had sent him from his cell. There were 7 in total, each more cryptic than the last. They were written in perfect cursive, every word precise, each ending with the same closing line. "You asked for truth, detective. Truth has many graves." The second letter was postmarked 3 days after his arrest. In it, Reed described another woman, a runaway from Jackson, 1984. Her name, he claimed, was Holly Grant. Lyle ran the name through the missing persons database. It matched a case file that had gone cold in 1987. Reed's words weren't random. He was leading them somewhere. He wrote, "She came to me hungry for salvation. I gave her peace in the field behind the chapel." There was a sycamore tree then. It's gone now, but the roots still know. The message sent a chill through Lyle. When they excavated the field behind Reed's old church in Jackson County, they found a shallow grave beneath a stump. The remains of a young woman wrapped in a decayed sheet. The forensic report confirmed it. Holly Grant, missing for nearly 40 years. In 1 week, the Pinewood case had transformed from a single murder into a pattern of faith and deception stretching across Tennessee. Detective Annette Carson told the press, "We're not dealing with a man of God. We're dealing with a man who used God as a mask." But even as the evidence stacked against him, Reed seemed almost pleased. During the next interrogation, he leaned back in his chair and asked, "How many souls do you think I've saved by now?" Carson said, "None. You took them." He smiled. "Then we're both in the same business." As investigators searched Reed's home, they uncovered something far worse than the letters. Hidden behind the study wall, inside a wooden panel, was a locked metal box. Inside were over 20 small folded notes, all beginning the same way. "Forgive me, I tried." Each note bore different handwriting, written in trembling script. Forensics determined they weren't copies of the one found beside Claire Martin. They were originals, written by other victims. Each note had traces of tears embedded in the ink and DNA that matched multiple unidentified women. The realization hit everyone at once. Reed hadn't written that phrase. He'd made his victims write it before killing them. He had been scripting their confessions. The district attorney called the evidence biblical evil. Reed called it salvation. He explained in another letter, "I didn't kill them in anger. I helped them make peace before they met their maker. They wanted forgiveness. I gave it." To the public, he was a monster. To himself, he was a messenger. Detective Lyle struggled to sleep after reading that. His wife later said he'd wake up at 3 a.m., pacing the floor, muttering pieces of Reed's letters. He told her he wasn't confessing for closure. He was preaching. He began reviewing Reed's old sermons, hundreds of them recorded on cassette tapes in the church archives. One, dated March 9, 1986, just 6 days after Claire's death, chilled him to his core. In it, Reed's voice echoed softly through static. "Even when the body is gone, the soul remains beneath the soil, waiting for God's forgiveness." It wasn't just a sermon. It was a memorial, spoken in plain sight to his entire congregation. By the time the trial began in late 2023, Reed was facing 6 counts of murder. His defense attorney argued diminished capacity, citing religious delusion and Messiah syndrome. The prosecution didn't need to argue motive. The evidence spoke for itself. Each note, each buried cross, each letter he'd written to Lyle. When the prosecution displayed the first victim's note in court, Reed smiled faintly. The courtroom gasped when the prosecutor asked if he recognized it. "Of course," Reed said softly. "She wrote it for me." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel. Halfway through the trial, Reed collapsed during testimony. Doctors diagnosed him with an aggressive form of liver cancer. He was transferred to the state medical facility under armed guard. His last interview took place there, recorded by Detective Lyle. Reed was weak, pale, but still carried the same eerie calm. "You came for more names," he said. "But you don't need them. They're already forgiven." Lyle asked why he confessed at all if he believed he was doing God's work. Reed smiled faintly. "Because even God needs witnesses." When Lyle asked what he meant, Reed whispered, "Every story needs a shepherd. You're mine." He died that night at 11:47 p.m. After his death, the prison chaplain delivered a sealed envelope to Lyle. Inside was one final note. "You looked for truth in graves. I left it in the sermons." Lyle returned to Maple Ridge and spent days listening through the remaining church tapes. Most were ordinary, prayers, hymns, scripture. But in the final tape, dated October 1986, months after Claire's death, Reed's voice broke for the first time. "I tried to bury her. I tried to bury the guilt. But even soil can't silence sin." It was the only time he ever sounded human. The state closed the investigation with 6 confirmed victims, though analysts believed there were more. Unidentified fingerprints found on several of the notes suggested others still missing. The case became known nationwide as the Forgiveness Murders, a name that haunted every church and small town that had ever trusted too easily. It turned confession into ritual. Every victim wrote their own eulogy. But for Lyle, the final wound was quieter. He sat alone in his office after the last report was filed, holding the original necklace, the one that started it all. He turned it over in his hand, reading the engraving again. "To see, love always, M. It was never love," he murmured. "It was ownership." He placed it back in the evidence box, sealed it, and signed the closure report. 3 months later, construction workers renovating Reed's old church found a hidden basement under the main hall. Inside were 6 wooden chairs arranged in a circle, each with a candle and a small Bible on the seat. On the wall, painted in faint white script, were the words, "Forgive me, I tried." Lyle arrived at the scene, staring at the ghostly writing flickering in flashlight beams. He wanted them to pray before he killed them. Carson whispered. No, Lyle said. He wanted to make sure they forgave him before he started. The church was demolished later that year. The land was turned into a memorial garden called the Field of Names. Every plaque carried a single line, "For those who asked for forgiveness," and never should have had to. The case was officially closed. But for the detectives who solved it, the echoes never left. Sometimes, Marcus Lyle said, when he couldn't sleep, he'd hear Reed's voice in his dreams, calm, quiet, asking the same question, "Do you believe God forgives murder if it's done in mercy?" And every time he answered, "Not yours." The church was gone, but its shadow stayed. Even after the demolition, Maple Ridge couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered beneath the soil. The scent of smoke and old wood clung to the air. Parishioners swore they could still hear faint hymns on Sunday mornings when the wind shifted. Detective Marcus Lyle returned to the site one last time. The memorial plaques shimmered under gray Tennessee skies, names etched into bronze, flowers left by strangers who'd never met the victims but somehow felt they knew them. Lyle stood beside the marker for Claire Martin, the woman whose necklace had cracked the silence. He whispered, "We heard you, Claire. We finally did." 3 weeks after the memorial opened, the state lab delivered one final box from evidence processing, Michael Reed's personal effects. Inside were his Bible, his glasses, a stack of letters addressed to no one, and a small black leather-bound journal sealed with an elastic band. Lyle hesitated before opening it. The first line was written in neat script. "Confession isn't for forgiveness, it's for remembrance." The entries were dated between 1984 and 1986, covering the 2 years when Reed's crimes reached their peak. He wrote in detail about his sessions with women who came seeking comfort, describing them not as victims, but as parishioners crossing the line between flesh and faith. Each entry ended with the same signature, M.R., Shepherd of the Forgiven. Lyle read through the pages in silence. There were no apologies, no remorse, only ritual. One entry, dated March 2nd, 1986, the night before Claire's death, stood out. "She told me she was leaving. I told her she couldn't take salvation with her. She smiled when I asked her to pray. When I pressed my hand to her throat, I felt her forgive me before she stopped breathing." The pen stroke beneath those words tore the paper. He closed the journal, his stomach twisting. Even after the trial, the headlines, and the graves, there was no peace. Only the certainty that Lyle turned the journal over to the state, but the final 3 pages were torn out before it arrived. No one knew who removed them. A week later, the missing pages were delivered anonymously to the Maple Ridge police station. They were wrapped in brown paper and marked to Detective Lyle. The handwriting on the package wasn't Reed's. Inside were the final entries. The first 2 were almost illegible, smeared, written in what looked like trembling hands. The last page was clear. "They told me to stop when I was a child. They said the Lord doesn't speak to everyone, but I heard him. I still hear him. He says there's one more." The bottom of the page was signed not with initials, but with a single word, "Soon." Lyle felt cold. The handwriting wasn't entirely uniform. Some letters shook, others slanted sharply. Forensics later determined the ink and paper matched those of the other entries, confirming it was written in the final weeks of Reed's life, but the message suggested he wasn't done, or that someone else thought his work wasn't finished. In May 2024, a new case broke just 40 miles from Maple Ridge. A 28-year-old woman named Sarah Denton, a volunteer at a local outreach church, vanished after attending a late-night service. At first, it seemed unrelated, until investigators found a note at her apartment. "Forgive me, I tried." The handwriting was nearly identical to the others. Lyle was pulled out of semi-retirement to consult. He knew that note better than anyone. He stared at the photo for a long time, jaw tight, before saying, "It's not him. It's someone who wants to be him." Reed had been dead for almost a year, but his sickness had survived him. Copycats, inspired by the news coverage, had begun repeating the ritual, preaching online about the forgiven path, quoting lines from his sermons, and calling themselves disciples of mercy. The FBI traced several posts on dark religious forums to a small group operating out of northern Georgia. Their leader used the alias Shepherd 2. When the raid finally happened, agents found 6 members kneeling in a basement, heads bowed, candles flickering in a circle. The same arrangement found under Reed's church. They were chanting a line in unison, "Forgive me, I tried." In the center of the room sat a wooden box. Inside was Sarah Denton's necklace. The group's leader, Jonas Pike, claimed he'd never met Reed. "He spoke through his words," he said during interrogation. "He showed us that confession means cleansing." Pike's fingerprints didn't match any known criminal records, but on his forearm, tattooed in black ink, was a verse from one of Reed's final sermons. "Sin cannot die if it hides in silence." Lyle attended the trial but didn't testify. He sat in the back row, watching Pike deliver statements to the court about forgiveness through sacrifice. It was as if the dead pastor's ghost was standing beside him, whispering. After the conviction, Lyle told a reporter, "Reed didn't die in that hospital bed. He multiplied." Tennessee passed a new investigative mandate later that year, the Claire Martin Protocol, requiring that all confession-based serial investigations include posthumous influence assessments, preventing copycat doctrines from spreading through media or church networks. It became law within months. At the signing ceremony, Lyle was asked if he believed in God after everything he'd seen. He thought for a long moment before saying, "I believe in forgiveness, but I don't believe everyone deserves it." By 2025, the Field of Names Memorial had grown, now bearing plaques for victims of Reed's followers. Each stone had the same engraving: "Mercy without truth is just another lie." Lyle visited every year, always bringing the same offering, a gold cross necklace identical to Claire's. He'd begun ordering them in bulk, leaving one on each new marker. On his final visit, before retiring for good, he stood beneath the sycamore tree that had regrown behind the garden wall. Wind brushed through the leaves, and for the first time, the sound felt like peace. He whispered, "You tried, Claire. We all did." That night, he sat in his quiet home, reviewing his notes one last time. The journal, the letters, the field, the ghosts. He closed his final case log with a single entry: "Justice isn't a confession, it's endurance." Then, for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of graves. Months later, a new detective sorting old evidence found an envelope tucked inside Reed's Bible, one that had gone unnoticed before. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Inside was a small scrap of paper with a single line: "The truth doesn't save you. It just keeps you from dying a liar." The handwriting matched Reed's, but the ink, according to lab tests, was written with a pen manufactured 3 months after his death. No explanation was ever found. The Pinewood case had started with a single note, 3 words written in desperation. It ended with an entire state rebuilt on vigilance. Reed's church was gone, his legacy buried, but the echoes of his sermons still carried in whispers across Tennessee's forgotten towns. the kind of stories parents tell their children to remind them that evil doesn't always hide in darkness. Sometimes it wears a collar and speaks softly about redemption. And sometimes it leaves behind the words no one should ever have to write. Forgive me, I tried.